Kalam podcast is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy listening to Kalam, please subscribe to the show in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now, and please give us a rating. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support the show with a small donation, consider signing up to Kalam podcast on Patreon for just $3 a month. In addition to supporting the show, you'll gain access to lots of great bonus content. Go to patreon.com and search for Kalam Podcast, or go straight to patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. Now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to a new edition of Kalam Digest. That's the weekly news summary. Today is the 3rd of September. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Edgar.
So let's start with our first story. There's almost 200 people killed in the last 5 days as Israel has been conducting what it calls its incursion. Other people are calling an invasion, essentially beefing up their presence on the occupied West Bank. Destroying infrastructure. We've seen these ominous pictures come out on social media where we see these like armored trucks with some kind of, it looks like, like a spider's stinger that just cuts up roads, rendering them useless, a lot of the times in literal refugee camps. This is, according to Israel, to thwart the armed resistance on the West Bank. I mean, I guess they would call them terrorists, and I guess they're doing quite a good job in terms of neutralizing this, in inverted commas, threat. It's not at all the same fierce resistance as in Gaza. Sam, what is going on here?
I mean, several different things. One is obviously that, as we talked about before, the settlers occupying, Israeli settlers occupying land on the West Bank has been gearing up in the last couple of weeks, since 7th of October, but even more so the last couple of weeks or months. So there's been more and more ongoing confrontations, and it seems that the Israeli government is somehow trying to bring the West Bank into play because in terms of armed resistance, there hasn't been a lot. As you say, it's been negligible compared to Gaza since 7th of October, even though, of course, some centers of resistance have been involved, such as Jenin.
It's mainly Jenin, isn't it?
The usual ones, Balata camp and etc. So, what the videos coming out, it's very difficult to defend, I would say, even to a pro-Israeli person as being anti-terrorist activities or actions. As you say, they are tearing up roads, they are tearing down buildings randomly, or perhaps not randomly, but not just a single house or something, but whole blocks. So it seems like they're trying to punish the West Bank basically for being Palestinian. Is all I can say. It's you're trying to find some kind of logic behind it, but it seems. Of course, they are killing people who are part of armed groups, but it seems like they're also killing indiscriminately other people as well.
Yeah, and I've seen which is typical of these kind of situations when Palestinian journalists try to cover what is happening. I've seen from two different videos, so this is clearly like a trend. It's a really dark trend. These tractors that are a part of these like armed vehicle convoys that are there to destroy infrastructure. There are these big tractors, and Palestinian journalists, like TV journalists, stand and try to do like a speak in front of these trucks, explaining what's happening with like a full press kit and a helmet and armored and a bulletproof vest. And these trucks start like driving into them. Don't hit them because they like jump to the side, but it's just an incredibly absurd and dark scene when you see a journalist with a microphone trying to report, and there's a literal tractor with an Israeli soldier trying to run into them.
But of course, we'll have to follow this over the coming weeks. There seems to be no reason to think that it's going to end, but also just another thing that's important to mention for what we're going to get into later on with the conflicts within Israeli society is the fact that there's also been significant casualties on the Israeli side. Former armed personnel of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, have killed a number of Israeli soldiers in ambushes, etc. So it seems clear that if Israel thinks that invading the West Bank it will not be anything like Gaza, of course, because the resistance isn't as organized. It's not an army, basically, which is what Hamas has, but there will be a guerrilla war with very high price for
Yeah.
Israel. Increased pressure on the army command and on different parts of the Israeli society, of course.
Yeah, the incident you mentioned was, yeah, a former presidential guard for the PA.
Yeah,
He shot three soldiers. And
yeah,
there was another incident where two young men, part of the resistance, I think it was a suicide bombing, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken. I think around Khalil, Hebron.
yeah,
And so these kind of operations, I think, will increase the more Israel intensifies its presence on the West Bank, the more these kind of operations will increase.
yeah. And
Um,
just the fact that you mentioned also the PA former PA officer, was also close to Khalil. I mean, and from anyone who knows the West Bank, it's I think that's kind of significant because usually the kind of ongoing battles are in the north between around
yeah,
Nablus and the camps and perhaps sometimes in other camps around Bethlehem, etc., and in Jenin. But the areas around Hebron in the south are usually pretty harsh. I mean, pretty well managed, well controlled by the Israelis. And if it
yeah,
starts kind of just randomly or generally getting out of hand throughout the West Bank, there will be something very different from just doing these invasions of very specific
yeah,
camps. They probably have good intelligence on who they're after, etc. They're all suicide attacks, whether or
yeah,
not they're long killing themselves in a bomb or if it's, I mean, they know they will die,
yeah.
the Palestinians. So if that gears up, it's going to be very, very hard to control for the Israelis.
I think operations, even inside Israel, will increase, like terrorist bombings and bombing of like civilian infrastructure if the West Bank incursion intensifies, which it probably will. And I think this ties into a later story, which will, civilian Israeli pressure will increase on Netanyahu. But before we go on to domestic Israeli politics, what's the latest on the polio vaccine? The ceasefire is still on.
Very hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean, supposedly there's a humanitarian break in hostilities, but on the other hand, as we just mentioned, 200 people have been killed in the last 5 days, and just this morning I saw on Al Jazeera, I think, 9 people being killed in a bread line. So
200 people in Gaza.
no, through the Palestinian territories.
Right.
But it's I mean, so there's some kind of humanitarian arrangement to make it possible to administer the polio vaccine has been in place for a couple of days, but we don't know yet if it's working. It doesn't mean there's any kind of generalized ceasefire, even in these particular areas of
Yeah.
Gaza.
I guess it's a classic case of because of the fact that there are no journalists permitted in Gaza, we have literally no idea uh,
Yep,
if
it's
this
true.
vaccine has been administered, if it's successful, but I guess it's something to follow.
Uh,
Okay, so the Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, who have been implementing a kind of blockade on the Red Sea on the Bab el Mand, is it called Bab el Mandab?
Bab el Mandeb, yes,
Bab el Mandab passage, which is one of the most like one of the sort of skinniest, if one can say so, passages in the Red Sea.
narrowest perhaps, yeah.
Narrowest. Thank you, Sam. The Houthi, I'm sure you're familiar with that, listener. They're stepping up their attacks on the Red Sea, and the U.S. seem sort of helpless in stopping them. Three oil tankers in the last couple of days have been attacked. I saw a take on social media where someone said, well, great that they're resisting, but also they're blowing up oil tankers that they don't really need to, which is kind of causing big oil spillage in the Red
Yeah.
Sea. Sam, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's hard to be an eco socialist, anti-imperialist these days. The Houthis are blowing up, basically burning like millions and thousands of millions of tons of oil, and yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
not
yeah,
good.
the Houthis have been attacking oil tankers, as you just mentioned. Three major ones have been destroyed, as far as I understand, in the last couple of days, and the U.S. have been, of course, retaliating, striking missile postings, but doesn't seem to stop them in any way. We've been talking about this on the podcast, on a Kalam shorts as well. I mean, the fact that the Houthi blockade is, I would say, is by far the most efficient kind of support, if we can call it that, for the Palestinian cause that any movement has been or government has been able to provide. This Anytime this happens, of course, the Suez Canal is basically closed
Yeah.
because there's to go through that, and global shipping has to go around the Cape Good Hope.
Can you in like a very condensed sentence tell us what you think this effect really has on global shipping and whether or not like people are taking it seriously enough?
What it basically means is will have an inflation crisis. You will have prices going up, and this will affect, of course, governments of the West a lot. Probably the producing countries of Asia are more resilient, but in the long run, or if this keeps going, I mean, it makes both Europe and the US more sensitive to it hurts their economies a lot,
Yeah.
and especially since we have this ongoing with the Ukraine war already, bringing up food prices. You will have the combination of food prices going up and prices of manufactured goods going up with oil and manufactured imports from Asia becoming more expensive. It is not a good news for the West. As we talked about on this specific episode, also a special episode, that I mean, it's easy to think that the Suez Canal is something of the past. It's not as
Yeah.
important anymore. But both the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal are, I mean, basically everything goes through there.
Absolutely essential.
All shipping goes through that narrow passageway.
Speaking of inflation sensitive and cost of living crisis ridden Western countries, onto the UK, which yesterday suspended 10% of its arms exports to Israel. Um, that's 30 out of 350 arms shipments. The media has definitely framed this as 10 as a partial arms embargo on Israel. You could also say that the UK continues to sell 90% continues with
Yeah.
90% of its arms exports. But yes, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced this, and it's obviously symbolically important, and it's obviously something that will make the Israel call the UK anti-Semites, etc., and might have just sort of strategic implications. What's your take on this, Sam?
I mean, yeah, as you said, it comes across as somewhat ironic because they're suspending 10% of the exports. They also have to say why they would do that, which means they have to basically go out and say this is a genocide, which is
Yeah.
what what's known for a long time. But now they have to admit that to
So
argue
exactly.
for.
So why keep 90% of the weapon sales? It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least it's not rhetorically great. I mean,
Not great
the
at
follow-up
all.
question being, oh, so you supported genocide to 90%. But I think, I mean, their argument would be something like, we don't want to kind of close down the Israeli army. They don't want to kind of make them totally unable to fight. They want to strike or kind of stop strategically certain aspects of it. So they're, for example, they claim that they are targeting the air force or the aircraft that are used to bomb Gaza. I mean, by withholding certain spare parts, etc. To my understanding, it would have been much more reasonable to just say, okay, we're gonna give you 2 weeks, and then there would be 100% or
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. We demand these things, or we will just stop selling arms. Another question is obviously, I mean, these are huge business interests in the UK.
Yeah,
I mean, the arms industry is not negligible, and
of course.
so I mean,
It's just like, I mean, the thing is, rhetorically, like you said, it just sounds like such a typical new labor
yeah,
compromise. Because if you're saying that we cannot guarantee that Israel's upholding international humanitarian law, then
yeah.
you shouldn't, then how can you keep 90% of this weapon sales? It just doesn't make
No,
sense.
we have to, I mean, acknowledge that it is a step in the right direction, and I'm pretty certain that there's been a, I mean, because there was a leak basically from the UK government a couple of weeks back where they said that the parts of the government wants to do this. Back then they said that they would just want to stop arms exports in
Yeah,
totally. But so I mean, what's probably going on behind the scenes is there's a tug of war inside the government or and
yeah,
between business interests and the government. So I mean, I think in terms of that, it's very important symbolically, and it will probably also hurt Israeli capabilities.
yeah, yeah. I mean, don't get me
They
wrong.
they have a lot of high tech domestic industries concerning or on when it comes to arms, but they are just like the Ukraine. They're totally dependent on ongoing. Every week they need new shipments of arms from
Yeah.
UK, the US, etc. So it's not like it will have effect in a couple of years or
Yeah,
or
no, don't get me wrong.
long.
Of
So yeah,
course, like whether it's right or wrong or good or bad, I mean, it's a significant historically that a Western
yeah,
country in general would do this. So another development to follow. And now on to our sort of main story for today, and that is the hundreds of thousands of people going out to protest in Israel. This followed the announcement from the largest trade union that there will be a sort of general strike in Israel, which seems to be kind of paralyzing the country. People are afraid that it will paralyze the country because, like, the minute that the strike was announced, the labor court in Israel issued a ruling saying that this strike must end before it even really began.
yeah, yeah.
I think they're taking it very, very seriously. 500,000 people on the streets in Tel Aviv, but we definitely should mention the fact that most of these people do not object to the war in and of itself. They object to the way that Netanyahu is handling it and the fact that Hamas hasn't been destroyed yet. They're not seeing results from this war, and the hostages are not a priority. That's why I think most people are demonstrating. Of course, there's a small minority that are, think that the occupation is bad and care about Palestinians dying. But I'm fairly certain that that is not the majority. What do you think, Sam?
I mean, absolutely, that's important to mention. The last opinion polls I saw was something like 90% of Israeli or Jewish Israelis were supportive of the war or thought that it should have been carried out in an even more violent
Yeah,
manner. So it's not a question of people being in this kind of peace camp versus a war camp.
yeah,
But of course, I mean, it's very significant because they are demanding a ceasefire. They're demanding a ceasefire as the price that Netanyahu should pay to get the hostages out.
yeah,
So still, I mean, in that very limited sense, it's a movement for peace, or at least for ceasefire, even though I would say for even for those out on the streets, I would say for 2/3 at least, it's still a question of they would totally agree with the war aims of destroying Hamas and perhaps even reoccupying or at least controlling the Gaza Strip. I mean, another aspect I think we should point out is that as very much contrary to popular, let's say, quote unquote, liberal Western opinion pieces and journalism, Netanyahu's popularity has been rising in the last couple of months.
yeah,
It's not really that easy to hard, and it's difficult from the outside to see exactly why that would be, but it seems to be a fact. So that means that what we're witnessing isn't like the people against Netanyahu, it's a fracturing or a polarization of Israeli
yeah.
society basically in two halves.
I mean, a
Pretty much
deepening of the
50.
cleavage that already existed last year with the huge demonstration movement, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Versus during that movement as well, of course, Western media tended to portray it as some kind of the people against the rulers, but there's a massive support for Netanyahu. He's been basically in power for 2.5 decades now, for a
Yeah,
reason, because he has deep support within Israeli society also.
yeah. I
So it's
mean,
a very, very polarized society. I mean, for people who don't know Israeli politics, I mean, it's quite similar to U.S. politics.
yeah.
It's a genocide Joe versus the crazy guy Trump.
It is. No, no, of course. I mean,
It's
look,
pretty similar in
yeah,
Israel.
there are lots of parallels. You have the religious establishment. Obviously, lots of religious establishments in Israel are not sort of pro-war and fanatical, but a lot are. So you have like some kind of ultra-Orthodox that, as well as the settler movement and the settler
Yeah,
movement, very basically a fascist chauvinist movement, and they together, that's a big part of the electorate in
yeah,
Israel.
absolutely.
Huge part. I mean, their influence is not negligible at all. The
No,
old liberal Zionists that the U.S. and Europe are so comfortable dealing with, they're out.
yeah,
They don't have any representation in Israeli politics. They may be sort of powerful and they make noise on the street in Tel Aviv, but it's
yeah,
not. It's far from a majority of the
yeah.
population.
I mean, so looking at, used to mention those specific groups, Meretz and the old leftist kibbutz Zionist party, and uh, and the old Labour Party, which used to, of course, to be the ruling party with, I mean, unquestioned ruling party for decades.
Yeah,
have recently unified to form a new party called the Democrats,
Hmm.
which is supposed to be some kind of secular labor Zionist opposition party, and they claim about 10%, I think, in the polls. So they're
10%.
like the third largest of the opposition parties. The major opposition parties being Benny Gantz's, I don't remember the name, is something silly like
Yeah.
blue white. Benny Gantz party is obviously he's the old chief of staff. I mean, this is not a
Yeah.
pacifist party or not a
Mm.
socialist party. This is a party for waging war in a more efficient way. And then you
Domestically
have the other
center
major
right.
opposition party is Avigdor Lieberman's. If you remember that, it's not just not a leftist party; it's a far right
Yeah.
pro-fascist party, which basically just differs because they prioritize the socioeconomic interests of Russian migrants, basically.
Right. Yeah.
But it's
Okay.
in no way. I mean, that's still a party that's in the opposition to Netanyahu at the time. At this moment, maybe obviously, I mean, he could bring them into government, and then he would have a stable majority even after a new election.
I mean, can you imagine in Sweden if all of the parties of the left
Yeah,
joined forces and only managed to get 10%?
yeah,
How
yeah,
terrifying that would be.
yeah. It would be just for our non-Swedish listeners. I think is a majority. I mean, in Sweden, the left parties would easily poll 45%. I mean,
Yeah,
40,
yeah, at least.
45%, that's a normal standard. I
Yeah,
mean,
between that
size.
and 50 at times.
Yeah, I mean, 45% is a weak, historically
Yeah,
weak showing of the left
yeah,
parties in Sweden, and we've been depressed about that.
yeah,
I mean, historically, the Social Democrats will get more than 50% on their own, with the radical socialists and the Green Party, etc.
yeah.
But yeah, so that's basically the traditional labor Zionist and even liberal Zionist movement is very very weak at this point. So we're not talking about a left versus right
No, no,
conflict
not at all.
going on here, but we do have a very, I mean, it is still very important and very significant that such a major part of society, of Israeli society, questions Netanyahu's leadership during an ongoing war.
Yeah, the airports have shut down. I mean, that's huge.
I mean, usually Israel is a very fractured and very conflicted society, but it's usually pretty good at doubling down when it comes to war. It's
Yeah,
usually good at everyone rallies behind the army, no matter what you think otherwise. But this is basically it's a 50-50 split for against the government's handling of the war. I mean, it was a very I think funny slash depressing clip on a video clip has been circulating the law I think yesterday of a obviously orthodox, not at all left wing woman, Israeli woman on Israeli evening TV. She's probably related to one of the hostages, and she goes on TV and says, "Well, I'm talking now directly to you, Sinwar," and then she comes up with a bunch of expletives about him. But then she says something like, "Well, you have 105 hostages. We can give you 10. Give us back all of our hostages, and we will give you the children of the chief of staff, the defense minister, and the prime minister. There'd just be 10 of them, but I'm sure that's a good deal for you and for us."
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Speaks right
Wow.
to the Hamas leader on TV, saying like, just we'll hand over Netanyahu's children, and and you
That
so
is,
we can have our back. I mean, I mean, if you've ever been to Israel, you know that it's a very kind of one of the nice aspects of Israel. It's a very outspoken and kind of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
randomly funny society, but it's also. I mean, this is harsh. This is not
This is
normal.
no, I mean, imagine saying that in wartime. It's really
Yeah.
intense.
It will be fine with you killing the children of our of
Yeah,
our
yeah, that's
kids, as
nuts.
long as
That's
you give
nuts.
us our actual children back. It's
Crazy thing to say in wartime for sure, and in any time, kill
yeah, of course.
kill the children of our political leaders.
Yeah.
I think that goes to say, and we should wrap up, but I'll just leave you with a tweet that I read yesterday from a really good Israeli journalist called Meirav Zonshine, who I encourage everyone to follow. She wrote that significantly the settler councils, which I interpret as being some kind of like labor movement or organizatory element for the settlers
Mhm.
in Israel, they obviously did not join this general strike, and she can sense like, I mean, that's just one out of many um, indicators of this like huge split in Israeli society. But she did use the word like brewing civil war,
Yeah.
which is also terrifying.
Just let me add one last thing about the civil war or the split. I mean, it's also important that, of course, this strengthens Hamas's hand in negotiations, etc.
Yeah.
But it highlights the fact that a lot of Israeli society are, in terms of on the negotiations ongoing, are closer to Hamas's position than to Netanyahu's.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Which is insane. I mean, that's nothing that would normally happen. And I think most important of all, I mean, even the defense minister Yoav Gallant has basically, I'm not sure if he said it officially, but it's been very clearly leaked that his position is, I'm fine with pulling out all the forces from Gaza as long as we get the hostages back.
Yeah,
At the same time that Netanyahu is saying, we could never do that. That's unacceptable
exactly.
just
Yeah,
militarily. His own defense minister says that's what we should do, which
yeah.
means, you have like a Hamas faction inside of the Israeli government in terms of the position on the ongoing negotiations, of course. Of course, Yoav Gallant would be fine with, bombing the shit out of all of Gaza, probably. But
Yeah.
him
He
saying we
senses
can't give
that
any
there's
concessions is just wrong. I mean, most of Israeli society, or at least half of it, seems to think that sure we could.
well, on that cheerful note, we'll leave
Yeah.
you. This has been the fourth installment of Kalam Digest on Tuesday, the 3rd of September. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining me.
Thank you, Edgar.